In 1944, Europe found itself in the grips of the most devastating phase of the Second World War. To the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing westward after achieving a crucial victory over Hitler's forces at Stalingrad and Kursk. At the same time, the Allies had landed in Normandy and were moving toward Germany. Yet, amid these epic battles between empires, another struggle was brewing, one characterized not just by national rivalries, but by competing visions for the future of Europe. In occupied Poland, this conflict unfolded through the Warsaw Rising, a desperate and expansive uprising begun by the Polish Home Army in August 1944, intended to liberate the capital from Nazi rule before the Soviets arrived. However, Poland's reality was much more complex than simply resisting Germany. For years it had been caught between two imperial powers, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. By 1944, it was unclear whether liberation would bring true freedom or merely an alternative form of oppression. This discussion will explore how Poland's unique situation, wedged between a disintegrating German regime and an advancing Soviet agenda, turned Warsaw into the backdrop for a tragic and brutal episode where the imperial interests of Britain, the USSR, and the exiled Polish government collided with the determined hopes of a population rising against tyranny. We will shed light on how this moment reveals deeper conflicts within the Allied cause, and how the Warsaw Rising exemplifies the parallel and frequently contradictory battles that were silently unfolding beneath the overarching global struggle. Greece's experience may indicate that the central conflict on the Allied front during the Second World War was primarily between communists and non-communists, rather than involving interconnected and at times opposing wars. The Warsaw Rising of 1944 serves as a crucial example in this discussion, with Russia emerging as a key player in Allied imperialism. In the early 17th century, Poland stood as a significant European power, boasting a population comparable to France and a territory that rivaled Russia's. However, as a historian remarked, Poland lacked the strategic geographic benefits that allowed nations like Spain and Sweden to retreat into isolation when their expansionist ambitions faltered. Poland, placed centrally in Europe, faced inevitable destruction as a state during the latter part of the 18th century. The nation experienced three partitions, with Russia, Prussia, and Austria claiming its territory. Despite several brave uprisings, the partitions persisted until the First World War. The modern Polish state began to emerge after the Russian Revolution in 1917, when Lenin proposed the concept of self-determination, promoting equal rights for all nations to establish independent states. This idea met some surprising pushback from the Polish revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, who argued that the quest for national independence, where both the wealthy and the poor banded together against foreign rulers, was less progressive than the notion of socialist internationalism, where Russian and Polish workers united against a common capitalist foe. Lenin acknowledged that while socialist internationalism was the ultimate goal, Polish workers would not feel secure in that vision if they thought their former imperial oppressors withheld their independence. Regardless of who was correct, Luxemburg's warnings about the dangers of Polish nationalism became clear once Poland was re-established after the collapse of the German and Austrian empires. Marshal Pilsudski, the nation's first leader, with the backing of France's General Weygand, initiated an assault on Soviet Russia, seizing territory populated by millions of Ukrainians, an area far larger than Poland's original borders in 1772. They even exploited the German invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939 to claim Szczecin. By the start of the Second World War, 1/3 of Poland's population belonged to national minorities. Domestically, Pilsudski established Sanacja, a dictatorship that lasted beyond his lifetime and continued to rule Poland as the war began. Ironically, Poland's involvement in the fragmentation of Czechoslovakia foreshadowed its own vulnerability to Nazi aggression. In response, Britain and France committed to support Polish independence, even if it meant going to war. Meanwhile, Stalin distanced himself, claiming he would not involve himself in conflicts instigated by warmongers who relied on others to resolve their issues. His reluctance had little to do with any anti-imperialist stance, as the Stalinist counter-revolution had erased all traces of that ideology. In August 1939, Moscow hinted at its readiness to join the Hitler-Stalin Pact, a clandestine arrangement that split Poland between Germany and Russia. The Anglo-French approach of appeasement likely persuaded Moscow that cooperation with Berlin was essential. Yet, the pact was a remarkably audacious choice. Nazism and Bolshevism were fundamentally opposed, and the Nazis had viciously exterminated countless German communists. Despite this, the Soviet Union provided Hitler with crucial supplies in exchange for arms. When Hitler learned the pact was finalized, he joyfully pounded on the wall and exclaimed, "I have the world in my pocket." As Germany began its effort to reclaim Poland, the Russians let the Wehrmacht lead the fighting, minimizing their exposure and hiding their own ambitions. The Nazis were asked to predict when they would seize Warsaw, signaling Russia to take its share. However, they misjudged the timing, and Moscow launched its attack 10 days early. In an awkward moment, the joint Nazi-Soviet victory parade in Brest-Litovsk happened before the city even fell on September 27th. Nevertheless, Stalin boldly asserted that the Red Army only intervened to rescue the Polish people from the unfortunate war caused by their misguided leaders, allowing them to live in peace. Behind closed doors, he stated that German-Soviet camaraderie had been sealed in blood, referring specifically to the blood of 216,000 Poles. The campaign claimed 60,000 German soldiers and 11,500 Russian lives. By the end of the conflict, Stalin had seized 52% of Polish territory, while Hitler controlled 48%. They both agreed to tolerate no Polish agitation affecting the other's territories, and to suppress any signs of such agitation within their own lands. Still, a robust resistance movement arose, unlike the ones in Greece and Yugoslavia, due to the close links between the local imperial government and the anti-fascist opposition. The pivotal distinction lay in the specific roles of Poland's communists and ruling elite. Unlike in Greece and Yugoslavia, Poland's communists did not play a significant role in this battle. By 1938, they were nearly wiped out by Moscow, and the party was officially disbanded when Poland ceased to exist. To put things in perspective, around 250,000 ethnic Poles residing in the Soviet Union were executed before the war began. By 1941, as Hitler took control of Stalin's section of Poland and invaded Russia, Moscow started supporting a new communist group, the Polish Workers' Party. However, it struggled to gain popularity due to its association with a past oppressor. In other occupied countries, the elite often chose to collaborate or remain passive instead of fostering a people's uprising. For the Polish ruling class, maneuvering through the German and Russian occupied territories was incredibly challenging. Hitler considered Poles to be more like animals than human beings. In his campaign to colonize Western Poland, he either exterminated or enslaved the local population. His ruthless tactics displaced around 900,000 individuals, and in some regions, it was even forbidden to speak Polish in public. Polish children were taught only to write their names, count to 500, and the fundamental idea of compliance with Germany. Meanwhile, Eastern Poland endured harsh repression under Russian control. Stalin sought total authority, motivated more by a thirst for power than by racist ideology. Still, like in Nazi-occupied Poland, there were no distinctions among those who suffered. Polish communists faced the same brutal outcomes as Catholic priests, university professors, farmers, and railway workers. A particularly notorious act by the Russian regime was the execution of thousands of Polish officers at Katyn. As many as 2 million people were deported for forced labor, many of whom never returned. Recent studies comparing the two occupations indicate that while the Russian occupation was less violent, it still included widespread terror. The Nazi SS and the Russian secret police often coordinated their approaches. Confronted by two brutal forces, Poland lost over 6 million lives, which represents the highest percentage of any nation's death toll during World War II. 90% of those who died were civilians, and half of them were Jewish. A resistance leaflet from 1940 captured the harsh reality. History has taught the Polish nation a dreadful lesson. For us, now, the road to freedom leads through the torture chambers and the Gestapo and the Russian GPU. Thus, the Poles understood that collaboration and compromise were out of the question. The tragedy touched every part of society. In Poland, resistance began in the military, which was the core of the Sanacja dictatorship before the war. Major General Tokarzewski, an ally of Pilsudski, formed what later became known as the Underground Home Army, or AK, laying the foundation for its growth. An author observed that throughout its existence, the AK was primarily led and staffed by those from the Polish military, who carried forward the ideals, attitudes, and standards from their time before the war. Essentially, the leadership of the AK was steeped in a tradition of reactionary dictatorship and imperialist beliefs. Historian Norman Davies highlights the importance of the AK, suggesting it embodied the entire anti-fascist movement. He points out that the largest resistance group in Europe, initially called the Union of Armed Struggle and later the Home Army, functioned as a part of the regular Polish armed forces. The AK achieved significant success. 380,000 fighters carried out 25,000 acts of sabotage over 3 years, and by 1945 had killed 150,000 Germans. However, if that was the whole story, the idea of a people's war wouldn't have emerged. There were two other crucial elements. One was the underground state, led by General Sikorski, who criticized the Sanacja regime. Sikorski argued that the movement shouldn't restrict itself to military resistance. It needed to transform into a true state, emphasizing that a state structure must be established and maintained at all costs, no matter how basic. The results were impressive. Although its base was in London, it replicated a wide array of government institutions in Poland. The Ministry of Education taught 1 million children, operated universities in major cities like Krakow, Lwów, and Vilno, and allocated 30% of its resources to social welfare. This shadow state had a parliament known as the Political Representation, and a directorate of civilian resistance acted as a judicial body that prosecuted collaborators. A vibrant underground press with many publications also flourished. The third faction within the resistance included the Socialist, Peasant, Christian Labor, and National Democrat parties, with the first three being left-leaning compared to the Sanacja, while the National Democrats were allied with Dmowski. He held right-wing anti-Semitic views, criticizing the perceived threat of socialism in the nation and the dangers posed by Jewish individuals, whom he believed represented international forces that could bring harm. Dmowski's influence lingered so strongly that even after the devastating events from 1939 to 1945, Borko Morawski, the commander of the AK, referenced anti-Semitism in his memoirs, claiming that Jews had indeed been a foreign presence within the Polish community. The political organizations reflected the majority of politically engaged Poles. While there were some resistance elements outside the Sanacja-led army, it might seem that Poland's resistance lacked a people's war aspect. However, recent history pushes back against this notion. Hundreds of underground groups emerged organically, grounded in the bonds of family, work, friendship, and neighborhood ties. This led to multiple conspiratorial networks, showcasing a spontaneous uprising against oppression rather than merely top-down efforts, though the exact scale of these organizations compared to one another remains unclear. A participant remarked that anyone with creativity, ambition, initiative, and considerable bravery could, and often did, create their own group. The complex relationship between imperialist and people's war elements sparked intense discussions about the ideological balance within the resistance. One Jewish woman expressed her fear, stating she wasn't afraid of the Germans, but rather of the Poles. In contrast, members of the resistance actively supported the Jewish Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943 and provided shelter to survivors. An estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Jews found refuge in Warsaw outside the ghetto borders, and the Zagoda organization, dedicated to rescuing Jews, maintained close ties with the Polish government in exile. A conclusion drawn in one book notes that no national group has as many often contradictory reports and opinions as the Poles. Poland distinguished itself with the consistent involvement of both upper and lower class factions in its resistance, yet significant internal conflicts persisted. The blending of people's war with imperialist war was never entirely smooth or complete. Amid the divide between left and right political groups, supporters of the Sanacja regime found themselves in a vulnerable spot, standing alongside civilians who blamed that very system for Poland's humiliating defeat. A significant moment of conflict arose during a key stage of the Warsaw Rising. Poland's military commander-in-chief Sosnowski pulled away to plan a coup against the civilian government leader, Mikolajczyk, out of fear that a compromise with the Russians was on the horizon. Another pressing issue was the resistance's strong emphasis on Polish nationalism, which overlooked the non-Polish one-third of the population living within pre-1939 borders. Despite the challenges posed by attentism, the AK was inclined to pursue it, driven by the same concerns that plagued other so-called official resistance movements. They worried that mass actions might provoke dangerous social unrest, while also aiming to evade severe Nazi reprisals, which were especially brutal in Poland. Komorowski initially shaped his strategy on the belief that the German Western Front would ultimately weaken, creating a favorable opportunity for a successful uprising. He argued that significant action could only come after Anglo-French victories. However, he viewed France's fall in 1940 as a devastating setback, leading their plans to fall apart, prompting him to adopt a long-term approach centered on intelligence and propaganda efforts. Yet, attentism rapidly became unfeasible. When the Nazis started forcibly expelling Poles from the Lublin and Zamość regions to make way for ethnic Germans, the only option was to permit the formation of partisan units, which helped put a stop to the expulsion. Still, the AK was cautious about taking more drastic actions. Ultimately, they had no choice but to adopt the strategies of a popular war due to the escalating pressures of the situation. One factor in this shift was Britain's betrayal of the Polish cause, as the country that hosted the government in exile became a source of disillusionment. While the declared goal of the war in 1939 was to defend Polish sovereignty, Britain chose to prioritize its relationship with Moscow, another major power, even in light of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. As early as October 1939, London made it apparent that it believed Russia should keep 90% of its unlawfully gained territories. When Russia joined the Allies, Churchill urged Sikorsky to sign a treaty with Stalin that recognized this change. The news of the Katyn massacre shattered this uneasy alliance, but it didn't change British policy. Would Roosevelt back the resistance, given the large Polish community in America? He showed even greater deference to Stalin than Churchill. Until 1944, no assistance came. As the Warsaw Rising drew near, the United States offered $10 million, while the Poles requested $97 million, contingent on cooperating with the Red Army. It wasn't until the Rising was already in motion that any funds were actually distributed. Karski, a messenger from the underground state who risked his life to inform the Allies, bitterly observed their indifference. I quickly realized that the outside world couldn't grasp. It has never understood or appreciated the sacrifice and heroism of our nationwide refusal to collaborate. The whole idea of the underground state was often beyond their grasp. This lack of comprehension wasn't due to a lack of imagination, but rather the shared interests of the Allied powers. Their dismissive attitude undermined the Polish resistance's functionality. Although the underground army made some of its own gear, in 1944, its vast number of volunteers had only 32,000 guns. With Russia unlikely to send more weapons, the Armia Krajowa sought support from Britain. The explanation of distance was offered for the refusal, but the more significant reason was likely the direct talks between British and Russian intelligence. As a result, leading up to the Warsaw Rising, the Armia Krajowa received merely 1/10 to 1/18 of the supplies sent to Greece and France. This disregard for Polish aspirations created rifts between the London exiles, aligned with the Allies, and the Armia Krajowa commanders, who faced mounting pressure from those at home. Compare the statements from the government to those from Warsaw just before the Rising. The former aligned closely with the Anglo-French view. Free Poland will serve as a strong support for the Western-cultured Slavic nations and other smaller countries situated between Germany and Russia. This statement purposefully distanced itself from any radical notions. In Warsaw, General Komorowski was anticipated to share similar perspectives. He had been selected as the commander of the Armia Krajowa due to his background as an aristocratic cavalry officer with known right-wing views. Additionally, he had been trying to incorporate the fascist NSZ into his ranks for some time, even with their ongoing violence against left-wing supporters of the exiled government and communists. However, Bor-Komorowski faced the growing strength of the Red Army, which fueled a sense of urgency that enabled the communist PPR to begin making headway. One historian remarks that Poland was witnessing a wave of radical sentiment, reflecting the aspirations of resistance movements across Europe for a fairer world after the war, advocating for equality and full employment. A notable sign of this change appeared in August 1943, when the right-wing National Democrats unexpectedly backed a proposal for a planned economy that included nationalizing public utilities, key industries, and banking. They also supported the requisitioning of large private estates for public benefit, ensuring health, education, and social services. General Bor-Komorowski understood that aligning with this sentiment was essential, concerned that his group of right-wing officers might conflict with the diverse membership of the AK. In July 1944, he warned London against inaction, cautioning that the PPR could assume leadership in the fight against the Germans, potentially leading to popular collaboration with the Soviets. To establish himself as a leader in the people's struggle, Bor-Komorowski called for a Poland that served the working masses. He didn't simply urge sacrifices for the Western-aligned exiles. He pushed for the expropriation of large rural estates without compensation, the creation of a welfare state, nationalization of industry, and the formation of workers' councils. As Tsikhanowski highlights, by 1944, the AK found itself in a fragile and unstable position, trying to thwart the PPR's influence while rallying public support through intensified anti-German actions, considering preparation for an anti-German uprising as their primary responsibility. Bor emphasized that their only hope lay in steadfastly demonstrating their commitment to fight Germany until the very end, no matter the challenges they faced. With Russia being hostile and Anglo-American forces too far away for a D-Day-style invasion, the strategy of waiting, often relied upon by governments in exile, had hit its limit in Warsaw. Attempting to ignite active mass resistance placed Polish leaders in direct confrontation with Allied imperialism, particularly Russia. This became clear during Operation Berza, or Tempest. The Home Army was expected to emerge from hiding as the Red Army entered Poland, and to greet the Soviet commanders with an offer to coordinate military actions against their mutual enemy. General Bor-Komorowski stressed that Berza aimed to demonstrate their resolve to fight the Germans and to remind the Soviets about Poland's sovereignty. However, it was uncertain which was prioritized more, an anti-fascist struggle or the restoration of pre-war Poland, as Bor found himself torn between the two concepts. Berza began in the Volhynia region, predominantly Ukrainian with a small Polish minority. This area had suffered under various imperial regimes, first the Tsarists, then the Poles, and now the Germans. To win local support, Berlin cleverly exploited Ukrainian resentment towards their Polish neighbors, leading to heavy Polish casualties. Before Berza, the Home Army concentrated on protecting the Polish community rather than attacking the Germans, resulting in many Ukrainian deaths. Yet, amidst these tragic circumstances, the Home Army sought to reaffirm Poland's sovereignty. A real people's war based on internationalism, emphasizing the shared struggles of people against all ruling classes, could have garnered significant support for Berza in Volhynia. Unfortunately, the Home Army chose not to take that route, and when they finally appeared, the Red Army easily overwhelmed the resistance fighters. This pattern repeated in other areas. While the Red Army welcomed Home Army support against the Germans, once the victory was secured, they insisted that the resistance disband or join a puppet army led by General Berling. Those who resisted faced internment or execution. Stalin aimed to reclaim eastern Poland after the war and did not want any armed opposing factions. The AK not only lacked military resources, but also struggled to connect with Polish nationalism in those eastern regions. Consequently, Berza stumbled wherever it was attempted. However, Warsaw presented a different scenario. The capital had a more uniform population, especially after losing a significant part of its Jewish community. Yet during Operation Berza and leading up to the Warsaw Rising, there was no talk of a major uprising. Bohr-Komorowski made it clear, saying, "I've given orders to ensure that our diversionary actions do not accidentally turn into an unplanned armed rebellion under unfavorable conditions." The fact that crucial weapons were removed from Warsaw in the weeks before the Rising suggests that the AK leadership hadn't intended for this to happen. On July 14th, Bohr stated, "Considering the current state of German forces in Poland and the preparations against the uprising, it stands no chance of success. Our only hope is that the Germans collapse and their army falls apart." A mixture of pressures, not just a single factor, changed this viewpoint. Concerns arose that the Germans were about to deport many young people from Warsaw, which would have weakened the AK. Meanwhile, the Red Army was moving toward the city, and on July 29th, they released a statement from Polish communists. "The time for action has arrived." It called for direct active struggle in the streets, to hasten the final liberation and protect our fellow countrymen. The next day, the message amplified. "Warsaw shakes from the sound of gunfire. Soviet forces are advancing and nearing Praga. They come to deliver your freedom. Citizens of the capital, to arms." Colonel Mahner, one of Bohr's subordinates, reported similarly, though it turned out to be incorrect, at a crucial AK leadership meeting. The decision for an uprising in Warsaw was made, and it began on August 1st, 1944. That day, the Home Army and the civilian population engaged in the largest insurrection of the Second World War. Historians debate the prudence of this decision. Davies sees the uprising as a legitimate attempt to break free from German tyranny, believing in the hope that Allied anti-fascist commitments would lead to real support. Kolko claims the AK leadership and the government in exile were more focused on maintaining their influence within the power dynamics, suggesting that the uprising was aimed at both the Germans and the Russians, making it inherently doomed from the start. This scenario represented a tragic end to the bold aspirations that Polish leaders had chased in London and within the Home Army. There's evidence to back both viewpoints. General Bohr-Komorowski noted that the deep yearning for revenge after enduring years of German oppression was unstoppable. The town waited anxiously for the signal to resist. However, he also hinted at the high hopes tied to the uprising, calling it the last card in a game where the ultimate goal was Poland's freedom. The Home Army was equipped for just a small portion of its 40,000 troops and could barely last a week. Still, with the Red Army nearby and the Polish Premier just arriving in Moscow, there was hope that aid from the Russians would come. The AK clearly needed outside support, suffering heavy losses on the first day, with 10% of their forces gone, while they managed to take down 4 Germans for each fighter lost. Yet, this didn't quell the public's determination to stand up to the Nazis. One witness recalled the joy of that moment, born from years of suffering and humiliation under occupation. They were willing to face anything, having learned to ignore the surrounding dangers. Crucially, they believed that the Polish armed movement would speed up the arrival of the Soviet army in Warsaw, pushing the Germans to retreat. An AK officer described the enthusiasm as citizens built anti-tank barricades and quickly set up soup kitchens to nourish soldiers and those trapped by the sudden uprising. The streets felt like one continuous celebration. Everyone played their part in this crucial battle. Just 3 days into the rising, Bohr-Komorowski observed how both men and women were eager to join the AK, signing up for various roles such as extinguishing fires, feeding the fighters, and making homemade petrol bombs to compensate for the lack of weapons. The Grey Ranks, part of the Polish scouting movement, played a vital role and faced serious repercussions. Despite the differing motivations for participation, an AK officer recognized a key element of this people's war in Warsaw. The distinction between fighters and supporters had disappeared. A British observer remarked, "Today, a battle is unfolding that I think is quite hard for the British nation to grasp." It was a struggle spearheaded by both civilians and the AK. Impressively, 1 in 7 of the fighters were women, many of whom were workers, railway staff, artisans, students, and office clerks. So the AK's method was far from that of a conventional army. It embodied the passion and zeal of a revolution, and they attributed their initial successes to this spirited first wave, which more than compensated for their lack of proper weaponry. Yet, this unity between the leadership and the grassroots, driven by a mutual loathing of Nazi tyranny, was still at risk of breaking apart. A report sent to the government in exile from Warsaw indicated that many individuals were less fixated on whether the Polish government should side with the Western Allies or Russia, and more concerned about its capacity to implement social reforms. The report cautioned against neglecting radical promises. The entire situation now depended on how the Russians viewed it. With Poland's future uncertain due to troubling agreements and their complexities, the looming question was whether they would rally behind the insurgents and the idea of a people's war, akin to other communist struggles, or if Stalin would regard Warsaw with the same contempt that Churchill showed Athens. Reflecting on these two leaders, we recall Churchill's first-hand account from his history of the Second World War, where on August 4th, he informed Stalin about British backing for the AK, suggesting it could aid your operation. The following day, Stalin brushed off the rising as overhyped and lacking in credibility, highlighting the absence of artillery, aircraft, and tanks. This was precisely the problem. The rising was intentionally timed to coincide with the anticipated arrival of Red Army support. Yet, the week the AK believed they could endure passed without any indication of Russian aid. Consequently, the insurgents had to adopt inventive strategies, and the high casualty rate eventually led to arming more AK fighters with recovered weapons. Public sentiment helped keep morale buoyant, but it also intensified Nazi resolve. German orders now dictated that captured rebels would be executed, and that the civilian population would face widespread massacre. The Nazi governor, Hans Frank, proclaimed that Warsaw deserved complete annihilation. On August 12th, Churchill attempted to persuade Stalin to take a kinder approach, reaching out from Warsaw. He explained they were receiving barely any supplies and hadn't heard from him since the 3rd, leaving them without both material and moral support. Soldiers and civilians gazed at the skies in hopelessness, yearning for Allied help, but only German aircraft appeared. Their disillusionment turned to vocal frustration. Churchill emphasized that without urgent assistance, arms, ammunition, airstrikes on enemy positions, and supply drops, their resistance would collapse within days. On the 16th day, Stalin responded, declaring he viewed the Warsaw Uprising as a reckless gamble. It was indeed a fact that Rokossovski, the Red Army leader on the Polish front, faced harsh resistance from German forces at that time. Even historian Davies, who sympathized with the rising, recognized the robust German counter-offensive to the east of the Vistula, making it unlikely for Rokossovski to successfully cross the river in large numbers. Nevertheless, the rising persisted until October 2nd, providing multiple opportunities for the Russians to lend support. Airdrops were contemplated, and Churchill and Roosevelt sent a united message to Stalin. We're concerned about how the world will view the anti-Nazis in Warsaw if they're left to defend themselves alone. We hope you will drop immediate supplies and munitions to the Polish patriots in Warsaw, or agree to help our planes do it swiftly. The Soviets didn't obstruct British and US supply planes from traveling the distance from Italy, but they weren't granted permission to land or refuel in Russia. Likewise, the Russians were uninterested in flying the short distance from their positions to assist Warsaw. The Western Allies undertook a series of perilous missions, yet they couldn't greatly alter the outcome. By mid-September, the Russians finally consented to provide limited help. Churchill saw through this tactic of delay. They aimed to eliminate the non-communist Poles while pretending to assist them. Harriman, the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, was shocked by the Kremlin's stance. These men are swollen with power and believe they can impose their will on us and all nations without question. After 2 months, the insurgents ultimately surrendered. The Polish government shared a stark reality. We received no real support. We have been treated worse than Hitler's allies in Romania, Italy, and Finland. Our uprising is failing while our armies abroad liberate France, Belgium, and Holland. With no trace of irony, the British Prime Minister who bombed Athens to suppress the Greek resistance mirrored their sentiment. Immortal is the nation that can display such universal heroism. These words linger in memory. The fight in Warsaw had continued for more than 60 days. Of the 40,000 members of the Polish Underground Army, about 15,000 lost their lives. Out of a population of 1 million, nearly 200,000 were impacted. The quelling of the uprising cost the German army 10,000 lives, with 7,000 missing and 9,000 injured. When the Russians entered the city 3 months later, they discovered only devastated streets and unburied bodies. This was their liberation of Poland, where they now wielded power. The heartbreaking end of the Warsaw Rising arose from several factors, including mistakes made by the AK and the unexpected resilience of the Wehrmacht. Yet, there's no denying the truth in Deutscher's critique of Russia. The cutoff of aid to Warsaw shocked the Allied nations, revealing a level of indifference that even caught Stalin's Western supporters off guard. Poland mirrored a pattern seen in Greece, albeit in different political contexts. Regardless of the ideological positions of the Allied governments involved, imperialists often opposed movements that didn't serve their interests. This underscores the reality that the Second World War was characterized by both imperialist and popular struggles that frequently clashed. In Greece, Britain attacked civilians, while in Poland, Russia let the Nazis carry out their grim tasks. The outcomes were the same for both. As one Polish broadcast poignantly remarked, it was a bitter comfort to acknowledge that, at least the Germans cannot seize Warsaw again. All that remains is a pile of rubble. Warsaw no longer exists. Although the Second World War comprised two distinctly different conflicts, they did not unfold in the same manner everywhere. Latvia faced solely imperialist warfare, leading one writer to conclude that the good war narrative simply will not work. This observation is crucial as it highlights the conditions necessary for a people's war, especially when compared to the experiences of Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland. Latvia's unique situation presents hurdles for historians trying to neatly categorize its history within the Second World War framework. A recent anthology from the Commission of the Historians of Latvia pointed out that the only group resembling a resistance movement in the Western European context was the Perkonkrusts. This name translates to swastika in Latvian, and in a country with a significant number of ethnic minorities, the leader Selmans claimed that in a Latvian Latvia there will only be Latvians, and the question of minorities will not exist. Members of the Perkonkrusts achieved this goal by forming infamous auxiliary police battalions and commando units at the Nazis' request, which led to the massacre of 70,000 Latvian Jews. Isn't it strange to label the Swastika Party as a resistance movement in the Western sense? Another notable figure is Valdmanis, who served as a minister in the Nazi-installed regime and publicly urged his fellow Latvians to join the fight for European liberation, aligning their destiny with Adolf Hitler. Privately, he showed a preference for Latvia's independence to come from Germany rather than from other nations. His biographer notes that the lines between collaboration and resistance increasingly blended. An official historical viewpoint concurs, suggesting one could be both a collaborator and a dedicated member of the resistance. This complicated and troubling position can only be grasped, though it remains unjustifiable, by acknowledging Latvia's occupation by Russia from 1939 to 1941, and again from 1944 to 1991. Consequently, historians view those opposing Russia as the genuine resistors, while Latvians who fought against Nazism are seen as collaborators rather than resistance fighters. They challenge the Nuremberg Consensus, arguing that the trials of Nazi war criminals reflected the perspective of the victors, overlooking Soviet atrocities. This controversial viewpoint continues to impact today. One Latvian dissident notes that the harsh realities of the Holocaust and mass killings in Latvia during the German occupation are often either consciously or unconsciously ignored. In May 2010, under the influence of the Latvian government, the European Court upheld the conviction of Kononov, the only anti-Nazi partisan prosecuted as a war criminal. He led an attack on a village believed to be harboring German collaborators, which resulted in the deaths of 9 people, including a pregnant woman. The Latvian state argued that the court should consider the wider historical and political context of World War II, including the earlier Soviet occupation. This confusion arises from the absence of a people's war in Latvia, rooted in its unique geographical and historical situation. With an area considerably smaller than Russia and Germany, Latvia has long been dominated by these larger neighbors. In the 13th century, Teutonic Knights took control, and despite Baltic Germans making up only 4% of the population by the early 20th century, they maintained considerable economic and social influence. Above them, an authoritarian Tsarist regime enforced aggressive Russification policies. Even after gaining independence in 1918, ethnic minorities still controlled more than 3/4 of private enterprises. In this environment, views on imperialism became vital. At that time, the leading political party, the Latvian Social Democratic Workers' Party, embraced left internationalism. Their policy echoed Luxemburg's belief that without the elimination of Russian or German imperialism, independence was unrealistic for a nation as vulnerable as Latvia. They argued that success could only be achieved through alliances with revolutionary workers, aiming to dismantle these imperialist systems from within. Consequently, Stucka, the party leader, stressed the importance of prioritizing class struggle over national issues. This led to significant labor movements during the 1905 Russian Revolution, where workers in Riga staged mass strikes against Tsarist rule, while the peasant class stood up to local German landowners. However, imperialism regained its influence, and during World War I, Latvia became a battleground between Germany and Russia, narrowly escaping devastation when the Bolshevik uprising in 1917 caused Russia to pull out of the conflict. Latvian riflemen were important supporters of Bolshevism during this period. However, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 compelled Moscow to hand over the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, to Germany. This likely prevented a successful revolution in Latvia that could have garnered widespread support. In 1918, as the influence of the left faded, nationalist groups, mainly from the middle and upper classes, began to rise. They were wary of the Latvian workers and their internationalist ideals, searching for partnerships with capitalist powers that could provide a state with jobs, status, and the ability to crush domestic dissent. Britain, opposing both communism and the Kaiser, was the first to diplomatically recognize Latvia in October. Following Germany's defeat in World War I, Latvia swiftly achieved full independence. It entered the interwar years with a parliamentary democracy, but this changed after President Ulmanis visited Nazi Germany in 1934, which sparked the rise of fascism. Initially, he targeted the communists, denouncing their support for a foreign power as unpatriotic. Eventually, he banned all political parties, including the Perkenkrusts and his own. While not openly endorsing extreme anti-Semitism, Ulmanis clearly aligned with the Perkenkrusts' sentiments, promoting slogans like "Latvia for the Latvians" and "Latvia is a Latvian state." The pact between Hitler and Stalin resulted in the Baltic states coming under Russian control, and in 1940, Soviet forces removed Ulmanis from power. In a statement reminiscent of Orwell's work, the newly formed People's Government of Free Citizens of Latvia claimed that the presence of the Red Army in Latvia and the warm reception they received signified strong ties and brotherhood with the USSR. An election resulted in a remarkable 98% confidence vote for the Working People's Bloc, which was actually the Latvian Communist Party, the sole party allowed to take part. At that time, the party had only 400 members, with just 50 being ethnic Latvians. By August 1940, Latvia was integrated into the USSR and its community of brother and great socialist lands and fortunate nations. Some Latvians were swayed by the propaganda. Swain's remarkable account of Daugavpils reveals how many viewed Russian dominance as the onset of Soviet rule, councils made up of workers and soldiers. At the Italia factory, the Soviets cut back work hours, reinstated a worker wronged under the fascist regime, and guaranteed pay for the days of the revolution. In military barracks, food quality improved, fascist elements were ousted, and everyone was promised equal rights regarding promotions and holidays. Yet, these hopes were soon crushed. As Swain puts it, Latvia underwent what he calls a 5-year plan in 5 months under Russian control. Power returned to factory managers, while party committees took place of the more inclusive Soviets. rationing was imposed, along with a staggering 300% surge in food prices. Through the Stakhanovite movement, workers were urged to boost productivity, all monitored closely by the secret police. While the Hitler-Stalin Pact was active, communists were told their role was no longer to fight fascism globally, but to persuade a skeptical public about the benefits of joining the Soviet Union. The Baltic economies needed to be rapidly integrated into the USSR's war preparations. By July 1940, the government took over all major businesses and banks. Changes in land ownership took place, leading many peasants to worry that their farms would soon be seized, even if full collectivization wasn't realized. The proximity of the Baltic states to Leningrad and the presence of German minorities, whom Hitler could exploit as a pretext for invasion, led to their removal, alongside other perceived threats. Thousands were deported, fueling deep-seated resentment. This unfolded in 4 waves, peaking in June 1941, when 15,000 individuals, including 2,400 children under 10, were sent to Siberia under harrowing conditions. This marked the regime's final significant action. Today, official accounts in Latvia refer to this deportation period as the Year of Horror, with some accusing Jews for these circumstances. One individual pointed out that a segment of the Jewish community, especially those aligned with the socialist cause, supported and actively worked with Soviet authorities. Given the looming threat of Nazi rule, this response was not surprising. One observer noted that the significant presence of Jews in the new regime led many Latvians to link the entire Jewish population with the loathed Soviet government. Furthermore, it was highlighted that 3 key figures in the security forces were of Jewish descent, which reinforced existing stereotypes in occupied Latvia. A more nuanced view revealed that Latvians recognized the perpetrators were not only Russians and Latvians but also Jews, leading to the sentiment, "Again those Jews." However, this stereotype was misleading. The Jewish community faced some of the most severe repercussions. Comprising just 5% of the population, they accounted for 11% of those deported. This discrepancy was due to their economic positions, perceived as a threat to Russia's monopoly. The Soviets regarded all conquered groups as potential dangers, seeking to forcefully integrate them into the communist system. Lacking a national identity in Soviet ideology, Jews were targeted for rapid assimilation, undermining their communal and religious organizations. Yet again, Jews suffered, as the actions of one oppressor pushed many Latvians straight into the embrace of another. One account describes how, following the deportations, the previously held belief that Germans were Latvia's main enemies shifted dramatically. Suddenly, the primary foe became Russia and the communists, altering how the Germans were received during their invasion. Latvia's Soviet regime collapsed in June 1941, overwhelmed by the German forces. Just as with Ulmanis's regime, there was a brief moment when neither side gained total control. Yet, organized resistance to Nazism was absent. Those on the left, who had managed to survive Ulmanis's harsh rule, found themselves bewildered and discredited after the Stalinist period. Instead, a grassroots national partisan movement emerged, targeting the retreating Red Army, aiding the German advance, and capturing communists and Jews. Nazi supporters created a center for Latvian organizations to take local control, but the new authorities ignored it. The Nazis encountered eager allies in almost every country they occupied, from Quisling in Norway to Pétain in France. However, in regions recently impacted by Soviet deportations, particularly in the Baltic states and Ukraine, this collaboration was especially evident. The American author Dean noted how easy it was for the Nazis to recruit locals to carry out their dreadful plans. Latvian historians insist that their fellow countrymen did not embark on genocide without external encouragement. Typically, the shift from Russian to German control occurred in less than a day, and there's scant evidence of widespread, spontaneous killings of Jews during that brief time. Still, the speed of the events was striking. The Holocaust is generally recognized as beginning in late summer 1941 and reaching a broader scope by October. However, in Latvia, the final solution initiated on June 23rd, just 2 days after the Germans established control. By mid-August, a substantial number of Jews in rural areas had been executed. with total devastation seen in the Zemgali region. This thoroughness was only possible due to significant local cooperation and awareness. Dean points out that there was a chilling intimacy in the massacres, as perpetrators often knew their victims personally. The Latvian self-defense commands played a key role in identifying and capturing victims, with 700 units quickly forming. It was clear the occupying forces had no difficulty finding volunteers. A look into Krustpils illustrates the local dynamics. Both the executioners and those giving orders were from Krustpils or nearby areas. In these small operations targeting Jews, Germans were typically absent, allowing local collaborators to act freely. Throughout Latvia, local perpetrators sought to ease the psychological burden on the executioners, often striving to impress their occupiers by surpassing expectations. The collaboration among Latvians was largely self-organized. Beyond the German Einsatzgruppen, groups like the Air Commando, which had 1,600 members led by a former Perkonkrust participant, played a crucial role, directly responsible for the deaths of 26,000 people and linked to another 34,000 fatalities. While motivations such as greed, cruelty, and anti-Semitism drove the Air Commando, one volunteer's testimony stood out as revealing and telling. He joined to combat remnants of the Red Army, Soviet activists, and supporters of the Soviet regime. Not all locals supported the genocidal goals of the self-defense squads. Members of the Air Commando recognized they were committing mass murder, but understood that most people opposed the killing of women and children, despite the widespread anti-Semitism. German officials observed that Latvians were largely passive towards Jews and noted that, contrary to their expectations, local forces managed to kill only a few thousand victims. Remarkably, around 400 Latvians have been identified as having taken significant risks to protect Jews from persecution. The dynamic between Nazi officials and Latvians was influenced by the fact that the Baltic states were the only part of Eastern Europe earmarked for integration into the Reich through Germanization, meaning only half of the population deemed racially suitable would be assimilated, while the remainder would be exiled or exterminated. This led Nazi authorities to favor Latvians over other East Europeans, yet they firmly opposed any ideas of Latvian independence. Could the repression of national aspirations lay the groundwork for a people's war? In Riga, the Germans established a self-administration under General Dankers. While most historians view these groups as quisling regimes, some Latvian historians see the self-administration as a form of resistance. Is that an accurate interpretation? When the occupiers called for the formation of police battalions, Minister Valdmanis suggested that Latvians should seek concessions from the Germans in return for cooperation. While it's difficult to claim that negotiating collaboration constitutes resistance, Dankers dismissed Valdmanis's idea. By the war's end, 49 battalions, totaling 15,000 individuals, were operational. The term police battalion was misleading, as their duties included combat on the Eastern Front, guarding the Warsaw Ghetto, and transporting Jews to the Treblinka death camp. Dankers' compliant strategy did little to mitigate the exploitation Latvia faced. The Nazis treated it with the same ruthlessness as the Russians. In the village of Audrini, where Red Army soldiers were concealed, all 235 residents were killed and the village was razed. The anti-partisan winter magic operation along Latvia's Russian border involved establishing a 40-kilometer no-man's land. Women and children who remained faced concentration camps or deportation to Germany, while the men were either executed or sent away. The economic exploitation was equally evident. The Germans seized property that had been taken during the Soviet period, claiming it as spoils of war. It's been estimated that Germany cost Latvia $660 million, while Russia's impact was about $1 billion, with 265,000 Latvians subjected to labor in the Reich. Once the willing workers were depleted, there was a desperate hunt for people, where squads would forcibly grab anyone nearby and load them onto trucks at gunpoint. Many at the time noted a striking similarity to the Russian era. One German official remarked that their methods were so brutal they could surely be likened to the tactics of the Russian Cheka. A communist prisoner told his captors, "We have treated our people so badly that it's remarkable you could treat them worse. You Germans have done just that. Another wondered if the Nazis were really Germans at all, but merely Russians in different uniforms. This provided more than enough reasons to fight back against the Germans. Finding proof of resistance is quite difficult. In a desperate search, some Latvian historians claim they've identified an elusive anti-fascist movement within a group suggested by Himmler in May 1943, the Latvian SS Volunteer Legion, a unit of 150,000 members. They label this as the legal center of resistance to German rule. Why do they make this claim? First, they argue it wasn't really a volunteer force since most of the legion was conscripted. However, even if that's true, being conscripted doesn't mean they were resistors. Their second point suggests that Latvians confronted Germany directly about the legion's formation. When the self-administration considered Himmler's proposal, it reignited the earlier debate about whether to seek more recruits in exchange for concessions or to give concessions as a reward for gathering more recruits. Valdmanis aimed for Germany to grant Latvia a better puppet status in return for gathering 100,000 soldiers, but the self-administration put forth a more modest request to appoint Latvia's General Bangerskis as the leader. That request was turned down, yet ultimately, the self-administration gave in and approved the legion anyway. The Nazis made minimal concessions, promoting Bangerskis to General Inspector with the title of SS Gruppenführer and Waffen-SS Lieutenant General. So, what does this center of resistance actually consist of? Simply put, a Latvian spirit was present in the legion from the very beginning. For instance, orders were issued in Latvian, and the ranks, roll calls, and prayer hymn mirrored those of the old Latvian army. We're expected to believe that fighting alongside Nazi Germany amounts to resistance, as long as the hymns are sung in Latvian. A more believable viewpoint on the legion is that, despite aligning with an unwelcome ally, Latvian soldiers bravely fought against their larger enemy, the Communists. Research into foreign veterans of the Waffen-SS supports this. While few Finns and Norwegians showed enthusiasm for the Nazi crusade against Bolshevism, every Latvian pointed to anti-communism as their primary motivation. Does the notion of resistance gain any validity from the fact that Germans suppressed certain notable Latvians? Indeed, the Nazis looked down on those who prioritized collaboration. Selmans was sent to Flossenburg concentration camp for opposing the ban on his Perkonkrust's party, while Valdmanis faced deportation in 1943. However, while Selmans was regarded as an inmate of honor, that was certainly not the case for the 1,100 Latvians who lost their lives in the camp. Valdmanis's deportation led to him being placed in Berlin's top hotel. It seems rather ludicrous to compare these individuals to genuine resistance fighters elsewhere who endured torture and death. Our final instance of anti-Nazi resistance is the Central Council of Latvia. Bilmanis, Latvia's ambassador to the United States before the war, claimed it embodied the principles of the Atlantic Charter and followed a policy anticipating the triumph of Great Britain and the United States. Supported by Latvia's four largest pre-war parties, the Central Council of Latvia was acknowledged in a recent official history as the largest and most influential resistance organization, with its main stance opposing both Nazi and Soviet occupying forces. However, the evidence for such a balanced resistance against totalitarianism remains limited. Some who make this claim acknowledge that the Central Council of Latvia did not actively resist the Nazis, arguing that military engagement would merely weaken Nazi Germany and speed up the return of the Soviet regime. The policy statement from the Central Council, backed by 190 prominent individuals, is often praised but infrequently quoted. In reality, it wasn't an outright condemnation of Nazism. The statement opens with a warning about the impending Eastern threat to Latvia, then expresses concern that Nazi interference with nationalist aspirations was hindering the full mobilization of Latvia's citizens into the German armed forces. Moreover, it served as an appeal to Latvia's own SS Gruppenführer and Waffen-SS Lieutenant General Bangerskis, whom the Germans relied on in their last moments to head a makeshift administration that would hide their illegal actions. It highlights the fragility of resistance when the Nazis in the Courland region of Latvia surrendered just a day after Germany itself, marking the official end of the Second World War in Europe. Another group claiming to represent resistance in Latvia was the pro-Soviet partisans. Their connections to Moscow complicated recruitment, as demonstrated by a detailed study showing they struggled to gain a foothold outside of Riga, Liepaja, and the Latgal area near the Russian border. When the exiled Latvian Communist Party Central Committee tried to establish operations in Latvia, local partisans deemed it impractical, leading to extended attempts from nearby Belarusia. Eventually, the Nazis' brutal actions began to draw in recruits, starting with the ethnic Russian community and later spreading further. By 1943, there were more volunteers than weapons to equip them, as highlighted in a partisan report stating that, in Latgale, everyone is eagerly waiting for the Red Army's return, due to taxes, rising prices, and German demands. By the end of the war, units like the Red Arrow, made up of Red Army paratroopers, Latvian communists, and deserters from the Legion, were actively fighting the enemy in various regions. During Stalin's era, estimates suggested there were about 20,000 partisans, though the more accurate count, reported by its own leadership upon disbanding in October 1944, was 5,900. We must also recognize the over 40,000 Latvians who served in the Red Army's Latvian Rifleman Division and other units. They found themselves just as caught up in imperialism as those in the Latvian SS Legion. The struggle between empires, combined with the lack of a people's choice, led to a civil war that saw both sides inflicting pain on their own communities for the sake of foreign rulers. The pro-Soviet government that took over after the Nazis faced difficulties in gaining local support, resulting in a shortage of native speakers for its administrative roles. In the Daugavpils district, half of the critical positions were held by Russians, with only 1 in 6 being ethnically Latvian. This only fueled their unpopularity further. Deportations began again, with 150,000 people sent to Siberia in just the first 5 months of 1945. The hardships endured by ordinary civilians show the absence of a people's war, as they found themselves trapped between two powerful imperial forces. This situation was strikingly illustrated by a woman in Riga whose family history includes a grandfather in the SS Legion and another in the Red Army. Her grandmother's farm was taken first by the Soviets in 1940 and then by the Wehrmacht in 1941, with both armies plundering it, followed by partisans in the war's final days. Another woman shared her family's painful experience after the Nazis arrived. My father was imprisoned. My youngest brother was deported to Germany at just 18 years old. He ultimately ended up in the concentration camp at Stutthof in Danzig. At 17, I was also sent to Germany to work on the land. In 1944, the communists took control of Latvia once more. In the turmoil of war, I lost touch with my family. Later, I discovered that my father had been marched to Russia at 71 and had died somewhere along the way. The aftermath of the Second World War in Latvia was equally grim. Without a people's war to counterbalance the situation, imperialism dictated the people's destiny entirely. Just at the end, Latvian nationalists pulled their loyalty from the defeated Germans, hoping to receive sympathy from the Allies. It ultimately made no difference. The results of the Tehran and Potsdam conferences validated the land gains Stalin secured through his pact with Hitler. This undercut the efforts of the national partisans, about 20,000 of whom resisted Soviet control following 1944. Many had received training from German counterintelligence and by 1953 had taken the lives of over 3,000 Red Army soldiers, roughly matching their own casualties. Latvians who fought alongside the Germans constituted the largest group of captured non-German enemy personnel. When the Cold War began, Britain maintained that Baltic Waffen-SS veterans were not war criminals, but rather displaced persons. They accepted the perspective of the pre-war Latvian ambassador, who argued that individuals like Aras were national patriots, anti-Bolshevik, but certainly not to be considered fascists. The United States employed Valdmanis, asserting that he had never engaged in politics and had an impeccable character and background. Latvian historians have sought to reconcile their nation's history by framing it within a narrative of resistance. However, this framing is misleading, as there was no movement that stood apart from the various forms of imperialism. The result was the devastating annihilation of the Jews and immense suffering for the local survivors. Latvia exemplifies how catastrophic the Second World War could be and emphasizes the significance of a people's war in other contexts. Each nation encountered occupation by the Axis powers, yet their responses varied greatly. In contrast to Latvia, Yugoslavia's people's struggle exploited divisions within imperialism to achieve success. In Greece, Elas bravely opposed Axis imperialism, but ultimately fell short of victory due to British intervention. Meanwhile, the Polish resistance, highlighted by the Warsaw Rising, lacked the firepower needed to defeat the Nazis and was callously abandoned by the imperialist powers that could have provided assistance. Latvia's plight may be the most tragic, if not the most extensive. The unrelenting wave of imperialist invasions squelched any potential for a people's alternative to emerge. The sorrowful outcome was a grim mini-Holocaust, as some local individuals mistakenly allied with one imperialist faction, the Nazis, believing they could combat Russian imperialism by targeting Jews. Now let's turn our attention to the Allied nations. Unlike Yugoslavia, Greece, or Poland, Britain and the United States did not endure Axis occupation. Nonetheless, the fallout from both wars was deeply felt there as well.